Good afternoon. Welcome to this lively lunch, or at least we think it's going to be a post-lunch lively session with all of you. I'm Celeste Feather from Lyrasis, and I am joined here today by my colleagues Scott Delman and John Edwards from ACM and Cambridge University Press. So those of you who are early, subscribers to this particular session may have noticed that Sarah Rui's name from PLOS was on here. She unfortunately hasn't been able to attend the conference, and so we did some change out, and so I think we have a very, very strong set of presenters here to talk about these issues with us. So I'll go first, and then I'll hand things off to John and then to Scott. And we're going to keep our opening remarks very brief, as intended for a lively lunch, so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers and engaging conversation with all of you going forward. Okay. So the description of this program was read institutions, right? What are read institutions? That might be a first question that you have. When we think about distributing the cost to support scholarly publishing, there are a variety of institutions, types of institutions and programs that have traditionally supported the whole scholarly publishing enterprise. And as we know, the diversity across our institutions of higher ed here in the United States mean that some are big research producers, lots of faculty authoring lots of papers and books, and others have an emphasis that is pertaining more to teaching, and less scholarship published by authors on that campus, therefore, is coming through the pipeline. And so you hear this dichotomy, right, of research versus read, publishing versus read institutions. And I just want us all to be clear about what is meant by that, because even, of course, the research institutions do a heck of a lot of reading too. And it's not that they only do research. But when we say read institutions, in this context, we're talking really about emphasis on teaching, more than faculty research, so they have fewer publishing authors, as well as institutions that may not be able to lend a hand and pay any fees for their authors to publish books or journals. And we've addressed some of the key challenges. There are many others that remain to be addressed, but I just wanted to identify them here too. We've heard for years now the remark that there is enough money in the system, but the challenge here is that we know that it's not in the right places for that easily enable us to redirect it to where it still needs to go. We know that a pay-to-publish model, which has gotten traction in some parts of the world, it really places the financial burden on those research institutions that have the most scholarly articles and books coming out of their authors. But at the same time, it sort of sets aside the financial contributions to the scholarly publishing enterprise that come from institutions who use those materials to teach and who could not survive without having this body of content to teach students. So I think another big question is, when you subscribe to paywall content, you are guaranteed access and in many cases perpetual rights. Those are your incentives. If you don't put your money on the table, you don't get that. So in open access, of course, we're taking away those barriers. You can still access, and open access hopefully is backed up by preservation, robust preservation, and so that guarantee of continuing access is there too. So if you take those two incentives to put money on the table away, why should you continue to put money on the table? And I would argue it is, for me, simply, and what we're hearing from member libraries here at Lyrasis, is that if you don't fund it and it isn't published, what are you going to use to teach from? So another challenge that we face here then, sometimes we hear conversation about, well, this collective funding models is just goodwill contributions, it's donations. I can't make a donation. I just can't do that. I can't get it through my state procurement system if I don't get something special that people who don't contribute don't get. So we enter into these conversations then. Well, is this really a goodwill donation, or are you actually funding scholarly publishing to produce content that your institution really, really needs? And what of these all new models, right? Are they equitable? There's a lot of conversation about that. We talk about various parts of the globe, what's equitable where. I would also say that this concept enters into the publish and read institution discussion, because if smaller institutions have been contributing substantially, as they have, to the scholarly publishing enterprise, to suddenly say, that's okay, we don't need your money, we're going to get it just from those who publish, at the same time, it lessens your voice in the future. And that's where an issue of equity and inclusion comes into the conversation. So these are things that I think we have to keep in mind as we go forward. Lyricists, in case you're not familiar with us, we are a very diverse group of institutions, mostly of higher ed across the United States. So we have very, very small, all the way up to very, very large, and everything in between. We have about 1,000 members now from the higher ed community. So when I say we and what we hear, this is the group that we are in constant conversation with. So I think for everybody here, you want to fund content to make sure it's available for use, whether or not people on your campus publish. But at the same time, understandably, you have an opportunity now as a read institution, if you're from that sector, to think about whether the dollars that you're paying is truly in line with the value that that content brings to your institution. You didn't have that before. It was an either or, right? You either do this or you don't have access. Well, now you have access, but what does seem to be the right amount of contribution to this scholarly publishing enterprise that is appropriate for your institution to make? And the eternal question, this can't be considered just a goodwill effort, right? So if you need incentives or you need something to show to your procurement office that you are in fact getting something for these dollars that you are spending, what do those incentives need to be? And that's one question that I really hope we can dig into after the presentations this morning, or this afternoon, sorry. And I think also then the probably bigger picture question for read institutions is exactly what is the role? What is the appropriate role for these less research intensive institutions to take in shaping future models of scholarly publishing? Because again, if you're not contributing to this scholarly publishing enterprise, then the impact of your voice gets diminished, and nobody wants to see that happen. So with that, I'm going to turn to John, who is talking about what Cambridge University Press is thinking of, and then we'll move to Scott from ACN, who's going to talk about what ACN has done or is doing. And so I think that will be a nice kickoff then to a great, robust conversation later on. So, Rob.
Great. Shall I
do you have slides?
Yeah, are they following on from yours?
No, because I didn't get them from you.
Yes, okay.
We've had this problem. I think it's hotel Wi-Fi that doesn't like attached files or something.
Okay.
Well, maybe it was my hotel Wi-Fi was blocking attachments on emails or something.
Is it? Okay, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Right, how should I?
Can we just? Okay.
Sorry about this.
Yeah, I thought we had it in place.
Do you have any audio?
No.
Perfect.
Just to sort of swap out then.
Wait a second. Comfortable for this. Go ahead and slide on.
Right, you did.
Okay,
Sorry about your laptop.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the Cambridge context for this challenge, and then going to introduce you to some of the kind of elements that we're grappling with right now. So in order to kind of frame the information, it's important to think about what read institutions have been supported thus far. And in the Cambridge portfolio, that's 400 plus journals across STM and HSS, and that's important. I'm going to reflect on that in due course. 50% of our article output is non-research content as well, which is significant for this particular challenge too. When I'm talking about non-research, I'm thinking about something like a book review in a humanities journal, which isn't covered under most kind of transformative agreements, isn't in the scope of mandates like Plan S, so poses a kind of unique challenge of its own. In terms of who has been subscribing, we've got a very broad multi-sector subscriber base that touches many different sort of revenue streams. I think it's very tempting to kind of lump read institutions into one big bucket, but actually that's not particularly accurate, and we know that there is a great deal of diversity within that group itself that I think we're going to need to navigate and think about long term as well. As Celeste kind of touched upon, you know, research article distribution does not equal revenue distribution, and that is the crux of this challenge. If we were to flip overnight to a purely OA model where costs were concentrated among only those that are publishing, it would be unsustainable. It's absolutely not viable. So that's what we're trying to navigate here, which is the big challenge. The other Cambridge context is that we've started a journey towards becoming a majority OA journals publisher. We've got about 2,500 institutions participating in transformative agreements around the globe now, and that has started a process of gradually moving us toward the point where we think we will be publishing the majority of our research open access. We've got a horizon point of roughly 2025 when we think we're going to start to hit that tipping point, and that's relevant for how we're thinking about this challenge. In a very broad sense, what we're trying to do is deliver an orderly and sustainable transition toward OA. That sounds fantastically simple, doesn't it? But it's so complex. And read institutions are critical to the success of this ambition. I think that's something we're all in agreement on. We cannot write off these institutions. We can't assume that they will be purely passengers and they're just willing to come along for this ride. I don't think it's going to be that simple. So I just want to introduce you to 4 different kind of questions, challenges that we're kind of grappling with right now. So broad and diverse funding bases are a good thing, and they will contribute to a more sustainable model in the long run, we think. The idea that you're able to flatten costs as much as you possibly can among a wide group of participants, I think is a really powerful idea. We've experimented with that in a few consortia settings where we're able to pool money and address some of the challenges by kind of collective action. I think collective action is a really good term, and it is a very powerful mechanism here. So those read institutions are going to be part of that really broad and diverse funding base that we're seeking to build. And we're not excluding institutions from participating in transformative agreements on that basis. We have institutions that don't publish anything, have never published anything in a Cambridge journal, participating in a transformative agreement. And that kind of, the role that they can play is really, really, really key. So that's something we're thinking about very closely. Alignment and shared mission is a really interesting one. And you know, I just talked about institutions who are coming on board to a transformative agreement with no publishing. And you might ask, why are they participating in this model? What's in it for them? And we hear this sentiment an awful lot, that they understand what we're trying to do, they see us as a good actor within this kind of change, and they really want to support what we're trying to achieve. So they're participating in this model at this early stage, in this early phase of the transition, really on the basis of a shared sentiment of values. And that's been really powerful for us, and it has really helped us build that transformative agreement customer base that we've got. But what does that look like longer term? I think relying on that goodwill, that alignment of values, isn't necessarily going to be enough over time. I think if you spoke to somebody who was a keen supporter of Subscribe to Open, they might disagree with that. They might say that that is a really powerful motivator and that will keep people invested. I'm not sure I share that. I think it's going to be a bit harder, and we're going to need to find other reasons beyond that shared sense of value for these institutions to keep participating. That shared sense of value isn't going to go anywhere, and it'll still be a really important differentiator, but I don't think that's all that's going to drive this. Changes in value proposition. I just talked about a certain type of values. I want to talk about values in the sense of kind of return on investment in a financial sense. We know that the portfolio at Cambridge is going to change over time. We've instigated this transition to majority OA, and that means the return on investment, the value proposition, is going to adapt as well for certain types of institutions. We can't ignore that. That's a fact of the transition. But how we address that with an institution is going to be a really important element of this. And having very, very transparent, proactive conversations about how pricing might change over time is something that we're starting to think very, very carefully about. So when we get to that horizon point that I mentioned in roughly 2025, we're thinking that the amounts that institutions will pay, depending on the value that they're deriving from the model that we're operating, which will be driven principally by publishing. So thinking about how that value proposition adapts and working really closely with institutions to think about what that means is going to be key. And what else might be available within that value proposition is something we're also starting to think about. If somebody isn't publishing, if they have historically just read the content, what else might they derive value from as a service? What else is happening in this ecosystem that they are willing to contribute toward and they are happy to fund? We don't have the answers to that just yet, but that's something we're in consultation with a lot with institutions, and I think we'll be confident that we can find things that are real value adds. We're not taking that for granted at all. We're going to have to justify it, but I think really searching in that space is something that we're doing. I know, Scott, you guys are doing that a lot as well. Lastly, the portfolio that Cambridge has with that HSS leaning does mean we've got a lot of non-research content. So what role might that be able to play for these READ institutions if they're contributing towards a model that supports non-research content? Is that a major motivator for them to keep contributing? Is that something that they have historically been very keen to have access to? They have a vested interest in that non-research content continuing to be published. Is that something which we can lean on a little bit more? And that's, again, something we're really thinking about. And this is a kind of classic Charleston caveat. We don't have all the answers. But it's true, we really don't. And I think the consultation that I mentioned is just so important. Talking to institutions and keeping that dialogue going and building what this future model can be in order for us to sustain group participation, sustain that stability that we need to make this transition in a successful and orderly way. We're just going to have to keep talking to everybody. And we've had some fantastic conversations so far. We're always open to new ones. So please, do participate in a way that you can. And that's it from Ken. So I will hand over to Scott, who's going to talk a bit more about what ACM are actively doing.
While we're getting set up, hi everyone, I'm Scott Delman. I'm ACM's Director of Publications. I'm going to try to make this a little bit interactive from the very beginning, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. First thing, how many of you are librarians in the room? How many of the librarians in the room, thank you. How many of you are read librarians versus published librarians in general? Read librarians versus published librarians. 50-50, okay. So the good news is, for the read librarians, we're not going to ask you to pay any more money than we've asked you to pay for many, many years. In fact, we're going to, over time, ask you to pay less, significantly less. The bad news is for the other group, those who publish actively in computer science and engineering, there's a reality. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. So what I'm doing here is putting up a few questions that I'd like you to think about while we are going through the rest of the slides. And I'm going to come back to this at the very end. But I wanted you to think a little bit about exactly where you're positioned. And some of this relates to finances, some of it doesn't. But for a moment, just look at those. Think about some of the tough questions, some of the tough decisions that you have to make on a regular basis, and whether or not over the next few years, as publishers progress and continue to transition, whether you're going to have to make some of those tough decisions. Okay, so a little bit about my organization. ACM is a roughly 75-year-old organization. Actually, it's exactly 75 years old. We are a society. We're a nonprofit, 501c3 corporation, and we are mission-based. So everything that we do is geared towards an educational and a scientific mission. We happen to be a publisher, fairly sizable publisher of scholarly information and other kinds of information, educational, practitioner-oriented, but that is one of the main roles that we play. We as an organization are driven by membership. We have about 114,000 members around the world, and they determine the future direction of our organization. Back in June of 2020, our membership pushed the organization to essentially set a timeline for transitioning to full OA, and that was a 5-year timeline. Of course, there were some caveats to that we do this in a sustainable way and a responsible way, but very clear statement that ACM in the future needs to be a fully OA publisher. And so it was left to staff to figure out exactly how to do that. A couple of the drivers, and I think many of you and publishers that you talk to on a regular basis are looking at open access as something that they have to do. I would simply say that that's not the right way of looking at open access. It should ideally be something, if you are, certainly as a mission-based organization or a library, it's something you should want to do. And I'll explain a little bit why you should want to do it, as much as it's not an easy thing to do. Okay, so we've got this 5-year timeline. Why are most publishers, and why are we in particular doing this? Of course, you've got Plan S for all of the content that you publish in Europe, and the funders of Plan S. You've got authors who are telling us, please transition, our members, the library community telling us, please move to OA. That's not really the main reason we're doing it. I would say the main reason we're doing it is related to our mission. When we look at the open access publication content, since we launched Hybrid back in 2013, and I'm going to show you this data in a moment, what's really clear, and we're talking thousands and thousands of articles that we've published OA over that period of time, there is a really clear advantage for the author. There's a really clear advantage for the scientific community. When you publish in front of a paywall, even if you're a large publisher and you've got thousands of institutions subscribing to your content, people that don't have access find that content, and they cite that content, and then they build on that content. And what we've seen over this roughly 9-year period of time is that very clearly within our journal portfolio, our technical magazines, and our peer-reviewed conference content, the number of article downloads and the number of citations grows dramatically over time. So this is the real reason why ACM is doing this, and I suspect many of the other organizations, nonprofit societies, are probably, if they don't even have the data, as mission-based organizations, they're doing it for the same reason. Not because they have to do it, but because actually it fits with their mission. Our model, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I want to leave plenty of time at the end. But I want to point out one very fundamental reality, and John alluded to this a bit earlier, is that the read institutions represent for us about 2/3 of the institutions that subscribe. And when we look at revenue or income that we need to be sustainable, about 70% of our revenue, before we began this transition, was coming from that long tail of read-only read-only institutions, those that are consuming the publications but are not creating the publications. And so John alluded to this rebalancing, and that is fundamental to what we have been doing. Okay, I'll get to that in a little more detail in a moment. But as we do this transition, one of the things that we committed to doing was to be extremely transparent about our finances. One of the main reasons for this is that we're asking those of you who are at big research-intensive institutions that publish a lot with us, we're asking you to pay a lot more money. And what our experience has been is if you explain to people why that's necessary, and you are extremely transparent about the information and how it's going to impact and how it's necessary to your organization, many of those institutions will come along for the ride. Also, very important to point out is we are not a large commercial for-profit publisher. We do not have 30 to 40% profit margins built into our program. We are running a very, very thin surplus, surplus of about 3 to 4% annually. And so for us, as we transition to open access, we have to do it in a way that preserves that revenue, because that revenue is necessary for us to pay our expenses. And we're really transparent about that. Okay, so let me highlight this with a little bit of data. Before we started transitioning to open access, 68% of our revenue came from that long tail of around 1,700 institutions that are essentially read-only. If we were to simply keep pricing the same for all institutions and move through this transition, what would end up happening is 70% of our revenue would be at risk, and ACM would likely go out of business if the long tail of read-only institutions were to cancel their subscriptions over time. Much like John, we considered the subscribe to open model, and it just concerned us a lot because it really depended on everyone in that ecosystem continuing to pay. And I think for many of the smaller read-only institutions, there's an enormous risk there. Many of you have budgetary constraints, and oftentimes you're forced to cancel for reasons beyond your control. And so what happens if you're generating most of your income from that long tail? The entire system breaks down, and it's not a sustainable one. So this is where we want to be. And by the way, I'm happy to send all these slides to anyone who sends me an email afterwards. We want to be in a place where when you look at the content that we're publishing and where that content is coming from, that it is a relatively equal distribution. Institutions that represent 1% of the articles that we are publishing should ultimately be generating 1% of our income. And that scales all the way up to about 100%. Okay, so what happens for everyone else that is at a read-only institution? As I said at the outset, the goal is to bring your pricing down over time to a point where we think there's a sustainable path. And whether you call this sort of a mini subscribe to open model where we do ask those small institutions to pay a nominal fee compared to what they're paying for access today, or you start to think about what are the other value propositions that as a publisher you can offer those institutions to keep generating that income. Ultimately, we want most of the income to be generated by those big institutions where that research and publication activity is taking place. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. These are some of the other things that ACM does, and we rely very heavily on that income from the publishing program in order to fund the good works that we're doing. Won't go into too much detail here about non-financial terms. Pricing, transparency, equity, sustainability. So this is the model in a nutshell. If you are a Tier 10 institution, typically what you're going to ultimately pay is about $2,500 a year, and you go up the the table. For the big tier 1 institutions for ACM, that means about 25 to 30 institutions who are being asked to pay $95,000 a year. When you look at the actual cost per article, you're talking $500 or $600 an article. We are not doing an APC model, but when you look at sort of that value proposition at the article level, it compares very favorably. Transparency. You're going to ask those bigger institutions at the top of that table to pay a lot more money over time. And you absolutely, as a publisher, need to show what you're doing with that money and why you need that money over time. So we've been really transparent about publishing articles. These are open access on our website. Again, I can send you these articles and all of this data separately. This is one that we did for 2020 finances. There's narrative in here explaining all of it. But we really want libraries to understand where their money is going and how it's being used. Okay, so the long tail, the red line at the bottom. When we started this around 2019, 2020, we were about 1,700 institutions. And we simply don't know, at the end of the day, whether those institutions in a fully open access world will continue to pay. And that's why there's an unknown. A couple of the consequences, and I'm wrapping up here. Certainly a transition to OA, I don't want you or anyone to lose sort of the perspective that we're doing this for science. We're doing this for the author in some cases. We're doing it for the betterment of society. Open access is just a superior model because it really addresses the issues of equity and it accelerates, if you are publishing in front of the paywall, it accelerates the rate of discovery. So that's partially why we're in it, and it's very consistent with our mission. One of the unintended consequences, I think, of this transition is that the large commercial publishers are capturing even more of your library's dollars. Many of them have launched hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of open access, pure open access publications. They're capturing APCs from the scientific community, and they're locking in these transformative deals around Europe, US, and elsewhere. The big get bigger. I'm very worried, and ACM is at a scale that's just large enough to be maybe sort of towards the top of this. But when I look at groups of society publishers, of which there is a very long tail of hundreds, representing a not so small piece of the literature that's published, 30–40% of the literature, they are at a real disadvantage. And I worry that those smaller societies and smaller publishers may get left behind. Should not be lost on everyone that one also unintended consequence of the transition to OA is the threats to research integrity. Predatory publishers, paper mills, fraud, plagiarism, falsification of data, it's on the rise. We have seen within my own organization a dramatic increase over the last 5 years. And much of that content is coming from certain places, but it's certainly coming through the open access side. And I worry about that. Societies in particular do a lot to address this, but it is certainly something that you need to keep an eye on. And it is one of the things that we need when we talk about keeping those read institutions sort of in the value proposition. Your dollars are necessary in order to fund a lot of the activities that societies like ACM are doing in these areas. Just as a sort of an aside, ACM spent about $500,000 last year investigating claims of plagiarism, paper mills, and other forms of fraud. That's not an insignificant amount of money for any sized organization, and we're not that big. And then lastly, of course, we've talked about this already. So let me just quickly go back to the questions. I'm going to leave those up on the screen. And then I guess we'll turn it over to questions from the audience.
Yeah, I can stand over there to make sure we speak in the microphone. So.
I have a handout if you want to Somebody wants to walk around?
Oh, okay. I have a few comments of my own to make after listening to this. And one of them is that each publisher has a story, and each publisher is different, and each publisher is going to have a different profile of subscribing institutions. We've talked to one recently that said, you know, I don't have a long tail of subscribers that don't produce articles. Mostly those who provide research articles for our journals are from those institutions that subscribe. Well, that puts them in a different situation then. Your point about subscribe to open and the hesitancy, I get it for your situations. And just remind us all that one of the leaders in that model is a very different kind of publisher, Annual Reviews, which picks researchers to say, would you please write up a review of all of the research in this particular area? Well, APCs or even per article costs just don't make any sense whatsoever for them. So these kinds of models, you know, don't work. They have to look for something else. And all too often in my long career as a librarian, you hear like, all publishers are the same. They are not all the same. Some are mission driven, others are shareholder profit driven, we understand that. But beyond that, who they are, what they do, the disciplines they serve, creates some really meaningful differences across the publishers that we work with every day. And one last point, and then I'll ask you for input, is that I hear constantly, there are too many models, it's too confusing, we don't have time to learn them all, we don't have time to understand them all, just pick one or two and go with it. And I would say to you, that's not possible. And that's not even a smart thing to do for the future. So I think we all have to just figure out some time to spend to learn why these models exist, why they need to exist, and what we need to do to respond to them from our particular perspectives in this space. So, okay, that's my sermon. So over to you, questions, and I have a mic and I'll run around.
Okay, so coming from a large research institution, I can appreciate that when we do put out a lot of the research, we do have to take our burden of the costs. But, you know, as a librarian who's evaluated a lot of R&P deals, a lot of times that means that extra dollars for a read and publish agreement means transitioning it from the researchers' research funding, their grant funding, to the library, which is not always an easy thing to ask of our institutions. So, and a lot of times when we're taking this up to administrators to evaluate, it really does come down to a question of what is the total cost savings to the institution. So for the publishers, when you're creating these R&P deals, is that something that you're looking at? Because sometimes, you know, on evaluating a lot of them, sometimes the read and publish deal can actually be cost prohibitive in that it's more money than just paying all the APC fees individually and the subscription. It is a higher cost. So, I don't know, is that just something that you're mindful of? Because just because we're a large institution doesn't mean we have unlimited funding.
Ask our publishers' friends to respond to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the question is, it's sort of how much can you stretch the elastic band, I think. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that the band has to be stretched a little bit in order to achieve what we're trying to achieve. But certainly from the Cambridge perspective, it's about genuinely making that manageable in the best possible way. And to bring it back to what we're talking about today, the continued presence of read money in the overall system helps that to be more manageable at the top end. We don't see the aggressive concentration of cost, which means it's prohibitive, and it's flatter, and it's more the institutions are more able to bear it. And I think that's kind of where our angle is on this, and we're hugely conscious of the kind of the scenario that you've just explained there, but that's kind of where we're thinking about it. But Scott, do you want to give the ACM perspective as well?
Sure. So I think it's absolutely true that if you're only looking at library budgets, it is not sustainable. Unless you're prepared to cancel lots of deals with publishers that are, for which your faculty are not publishing. It is absolutely the case in the deals that we've done. We've done about 325 deals with different institutions around the world. And for the bigger ones, where there's an enormous price increase, I mean, in some cases, it's a 10x price increase, that those institutions actually see these deals having an enormous value, even though the price increase is great. So it's really all about value. In some cases, I would say fewer than 25%, the institutions see the value, they understand the transparency, the equity, the need to pay more, but they just don't have the dollars. And what we found that many of them have done and have been willing to actually sign on is gone to the departments, started talking to the department heads, talked to the faculty, get an understanding of where the research funding is coming from. We haven't actually gotten into the whole data discussion. Maybe somebody will ask a question about metadata and tagging data, because I think that's going to be part of this thread, is understanding where that funding actually is that can underwrite the cost of these deals. But we've definitely seen examples where librarians have gone to the departments, they've gone to the Dean of Research, they've gone to the Vice Provost of Research, they've gone to the department head, and they've explained the value, they've explained the costs. You can see in very sort of tangible terms, how many articles does that translate into in terms of dollars per article. And there's been cost sharing. I've seen in more than half of the deals that we've done, the institutions have never reached out to their faculty. They haven't reached out to those other departments. They try to find the money from within their library budgets. And at those institutions that publish a lot with us, I guess we're one of the primary publishers of their content, so they see that as must-have, and they're able to find the money. But I think that there is for probably many of the institutions that publish, but not a lot, there has to be communication between the library and the other stakeholders in the process for this to work. Otherwise, I agree, it's just not sustainable, whether it's our model or someone else's. So those communications, if you're not doing it already, you got to start. I mean, that absolutely is one of the things that we've seen to some extent as a success story, but it's still an ongoing challenge.
So what advice would you have for a research institution that has the vision to see the value, and there is no mythical money fairy on campus that will magically rain down the differential from on high, while the library is being aggressively pummeled by several purveyors of such models who will remain nameless? But the money is not there, and so the budget is capped, and it's a reality. So what advice would you have for those situations where the values are completely on board, but the money simply won't carry us forward? And what models would you suggest to work around that? And what model structures would you suggest for addressing those issues?
This is a huge question. Yeah, this gets right to the heart of it. I think.
And it's a very prevalent scenario.
Of course, yeah. I'll say two things. I think I feel quite strongly that the pressure, like the situation you describe, suggests that the conversations that some publishers are having with institutions are simply not viable. They're not going to work. And I think there's a pressure upon publishers to change the models that they're offering. I think there's a really clear signal coming out which we hear so often, kind of anecdotally. And so what are we, like, as an industry, what are we pursuing if large sectors of it are saying this actually is just not going to work for us? You know, that seems like a really fundamental issue to address. And some of the, you know, I certainly count Cambridge in this camp, you know, on this side of the fence, we're doing everything we can to rebalance that and put forward a model that we genuinely think is viable. The other thing I'll say is that I think there's real space to explore. We have the multi-payer University of California model. We were the first publisher to build that with them, which we're very proud of, and I think that's a really interesting mechanism that has a very important role to play in helping that elastic band flex, if I can sort of batter that slightly rubbish metaphor. You know, that's going to really help stretch or flatten the costs at an institutional level by supplementing with some of that external funding, the money that we know is in the system that just needs to be found and identified and used in the right context. Yeah, Scott.
And John, just to be clear, when you talk about the multi-payer model of the University of California system, that's the library, that's departments, that's grant funds. Are there any other sources of revenue coming in to that multi-payer system?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, well, that's what we're aware of in the context of our deal. Yeah.
So I'm going to say this a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think part of the answer to your question is, as a librarian, you have to be ruthless. You have to be willing to take really hard decisions, and I can count the number of very public instances of embargoes from universities on large commercial publishers that have essentially co-opted an extremely large percentage of your budgets. And those willing to actually push back in a meaningful way, it's a very small number. I do believe, I mean, in our area, most of what we publish is funded by research grants, whether that's public or private grants in Europe, US, Asia, elsewhere. And so it is a question of figuring out how to tap into those funds. In our case, we've made a commitment by the end of 2025 that we're going to do a full flip. And what does that full flip mean for our authors? It means that if you are a corresponding author at an institution and your university has not signed on to one of these institutional deals, if you get accepted into one of our publications, you have to pay an APC. If you don't pay an APC, you can't publish with ACM. We are publishing something on the order of 75 to 80,000 authors a year, 25,000 articles a year. That is going to have severe consequences for the research community. We know that our authors don't like paying APCs. We know if we move to a model that is just APCs, that's going to be very problematic for everyone. But it's also going to be problematic for librarians because you're going to be outside of that, that discussion and that transaction.
Good question. Follow-up?
Well, the risk with the APCs is that if the library has no funding, no one else on campus has funding, then the author has a choice between giving up the family's annual grocery budget out of pocket or just not getting published. And that's the reality, and that then risks the body of research not being representative of the knowledge that exists.
So I think most publishers, certainly we, and I'm sure Cambridge, have pools of money that are set aside as a result of hybrid OA that can be used for needs-based requests. So an author can really prove that there is no funding, there's no research grant. Typically they're from a developing nation. Don't tend to see that in the US. Even at small institutions. In computer science, most of our authors are getting research grants. We know that because we're asking them to provide us with that information. That's metadata that's captured at submission or on publication, prior to publication. But I think a scenario where someone really comes to us and says, I've been accepted into your journal, but I have no means to pay the APC, we have funds available for that. But what we're not going to do, because it's just not sustainable, every time an author says, I don't want to pay an APC if they have to, we're not in a position, and we're not going to be in a position to just say, okay, we'll waive that fee. For ACM, it's very clear we want to avoid the APC model. By the end of 2025, we're hoping to be at around 75% of the articles we publish will be locked into these deals. We're at roughly 30% now. But what isn't locked into those deals, APCs are going to be the only route.
I think Scott made a very important point there as part of his response, which is that's something to deal with, great when you're working in a discipline that is largely research grant funded. That's not the case for a lot of these areas, and therefore different types of models are needed to fit those certain circumstances. Right, another question? Comment? Share your wisdom, please, because we're all looking for the same answers. Well, then I have one. We've talked about the need for some sort of incentive. If the incentive is no longer, my community can access this content, I can access it forever for them. If those incentives goes away, what other kinds of incentives might motivate people to step up and keep money on the table? I know in some cases, some of the emerging models, it's backfile content. If you don't pay to keep the open stuff coming in the forthcoming list, you don't get access to the back files. But at some point, that's going to diminish too, because time marches on.
I think the risk of the post-lunch is the food coma
I know.
that occurs.
Coffee is worn off. So I think the fact maybe that you don't have ready answers means that we don't know collectively, and we need to figure it out. One of the hardest things for me really is dealing with institutions that are funded by states that are absolutely forbidden to spend a dime on something that anybody else in the world can get without spending a dime. And that speaks to a larger societal change about the value of the scholarly publishing work, which is a big, big question.
I'll just build on that for a second. Christina Drummond with the OA Book Usage Data Trust. I think that one of the challenges we have here is we think about pulling together all this and the data we will have around OA usage and impact is what those potential, economists would call it network externalities, but what are the potential unintended negative consequences that this big data can have when we link it? And how, the question is for us now, how do we build guardrails so that as it becomes machine readable, AI accessible, that we have those guardrails in place so we know we're not limiting scholarly freedom, we're not impacting privacy, and we're not having unintended negative consequences on scholarly output. Thanks, Christina.
I will say, yes, usage, right? That's a common question that I address. Well, I can't tell how my campus is using this. Geolocation data is great, but if I'm in the middle of a big city and there are 4 universities here, how do I know which part I'm responsible for? And again, we don't know. We just don't know. But if you don't know about the Open Access eBook Trust, Usage Data Trust, lots of words in it. Talk to Christina. She'll be happy to fill you in. It's a great emerging project.
I think one of the risks of the transition is as publishers move towards APC-driven OA. If read and publish deals, if institutional deals with libraries don't get done over the longer term and the whole ecosystem moves in that direction, and then it's simply a transaction between the publisher and the individual author, you're at risk of losing all of the data around that, understanding who's doing what research, how is that research impacting the broader world, where is the funding coming from. And so, I mean, one of the things that when we launched our service in 2020, we never thought about was the amount of effort, time, and money that was going to be involved in building, and I see Yvonne is smiling here, building a dashboard, building our own dashboard to provide that kind of data back to the institutions so that they could see what the activity was at a high level, generate reports, be able to see which faculty were publishing on what topics, where are the funds that are connected to those, who's giving them research dollars. And I do think that one of the advantages of having these institutional models and the relationship between the publisher and the libraries has historically been the ability to actually sort of manage for the stakeholders within the university sort of how those resources are being used and where the value proposition is. You don't want that to be lost. And if you go the route of just saying, okay, the departments can take care of OA fees themselves, then you're not in that process. I mean, one of the things that I heard yesterday in one of the exhibit halls was a potential movement like Counter 5, like counting usage statistics in a consistent, standardized way, being able to have a standard for reporting on publication data. I mean, this has been, for us, where we've been in the last 3 years from where we started to where we are today, and how much further we have to go in terms of making sure that the data is clean, it's accurate, we're capturing all of it. It's night and day, and I think not having a consistent vocabulary where, as libraries, you can actually compare this publisher against this publisher's data when they send it to you. I think that's really critical. I mean, the infrastructure, you know, it's taken 20 years to get to this point, right? Open access started 20 years ago as a movement. It's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that it's really accelerated. Some of that may be related to COVID, but I think a lot of it is because there haven't been that many entrants in terms of infrastructure companies that sort of were really starting to put the pieces together to provide that underlying infrastructure. Crossref, Chorus, Orchid,
All the persistent
All
identifier communities,
all
right?
of these,
Yeah.
and this is, we haven't talked too much about it today, but the data, the underlying metadata, and being able to tag content, so you can even understand what is an APC eligible article, and is an APC eligible article from Elsevier the same as one from IEEE? They're talking different languages oftentimes, so how do you compare? So it's just, I think you want to be in that conversation, and even if it means, you know, your deal is the same dollars as it was for just read access, you want to be in that conversation, because all of these other elements that are being factored into these deals, how we report on data, how we calculate it, that's really critical. And it needs to be aggregated somewhere at the university level, not at the individual author level.
I think something on that data point as well, we haven't really talked about the role, so within the context of a reading institution, we at Cambridge see lots of our, what we would call a reading institution, publishing maybe one article over the course of a 3-year period. But that's because we're looking at the corresponding authors on the papers. So, to your data point, Scott, what if we were all able to have incredible visibility on the contributing authors, and if there were institutional identifiers placed against those guys, doesn't that enrich the view that we've got and give us potentially some other options in terms of, you know, that really big issue of managing those costs at the top end, flattening them out, more contributors, the whole thing becomes a bit more sustainable. But speaking personally, you know, just from the Cambridge perspective, we don't have visibility on that. We haven't got good enough article data to be able to get the view on where the contributing authors are. We've needed to kind of work our data into a good enough state to get the corresponding author piece firm, and we haven't been able to get the extra.
And right, I'll just bring up Sarah Rui from PLOS, who originally created the vision for this session, because they've done something really interesting in their community action plan model, determining the various tiers. They have looked at the corresponding author, or the person whose name comes first, as well as all of the other authors. And what they have really found is that once you start looking at the second and third and fourth authors, many more institutions start showing up as being part of the publishing process. And that's allowed them to more evenly distribute the proposed costs across the various types and sizes of institutions, but it has been a horrendous amount of data gathering work for them. It's really hard. And one of the biggest problems is that there isn't a widely used common institutional identifier. There's some out there, but they're not used nearly enough. So another variation on the theme, but metadata, right? It's all about metadata if we want this to work. So it's not boring, dig into it, understand your metadata, and make sure it's clean.
There's also a role for funders to play. I don't know if we have any funders in the room.
We are at time too, so. No, go ahead.
So publishers can only do so much in terms of mandating things for their authors. But we hear a lot, whether it's Plan S in Europe or recently OSTP in the US, about new mandates coming down. Those mandates have been around. They will continue to change. What doesn't exist is enforcement. And so even at the level of having a funder require that the grant recipient lists the funding information on the published work. And if you don't have if the author doesn't do that, because they're required to do that, then that's a whole element of data we don't have access to.
Right.
And it's data that you need because you want to be able to tap into some of those funds over time.
Right. Thank you all very much.